Melanie Finn, welcome back to my bookshelf.
Hey, Jen, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, my pleasure. I love that you're our first repeat guest.
Well, I feel deeply honored, and especially about a book that I wrote 5 years ago now.
Yeah,
So
I know. I'm digging back in
thank you
the
for
old,
picking it up.
yeah, in the old stuff. My goal is that I'm going to have you on every year. Now I have to read a book a year by Melanie Finn.
Well, I probably should hurry up and finish the next one then. So because I feel like I'm falling behind on that one. So I think you've got The Gloaming left.
Yes.
So that could be
Yeah,
next year.
yeah, that'll be next year.
Okay, so I've got to have something ready for 2025 then.
Yes, we really
Okay.
need that. Okay, so like don't let us down on that. We're talking today about the underneath. And I kind of like to start with just getting your general quick pitch of what this book is about for anyone who's listening who hasn't read it.
So the underneath is about a journalist, a former war correspondent called Kay, who is married, a slightly dodgy marriage to her husband Michael, who's a documentary filmmaker, and they have a couple of kids. They're living in London. They decide that they need a time out together as a family, so they rent an old farmhouse in a remote corner of Vermont where they're going to have this summertime together. And within days of arriving, two things happen. The first is that Kate starts to think about how much she really hates her husband, and he is called away to a shoot in West Africa, leaving her alone with the kids. And she, a few days after that, finds some creepy writing in a hidden closet in the bathroom. And that kind of triggers a lot of reactions in her that kind of catapults her into this story that I guess you would call it like a rural thriller, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was saying it feels like, if someone liked Winter's Bone or Mayor of Easttown, that this would be their vibe in terms of storytelling.
definitely. I mean, you've got your strong female lead, and good looking, but shady love interest. You've got, your local drug dealers, you've got all kinds of skullduggery going on in the high hills of Vermont. And kind of woven through that is this woman trying to come to terms with what motherhood means to her. I think probably as she rides the wave of probably some post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, for
So
sure. Yeah, it seems like it. It's so interesting because the book is so much about children and yet not about children. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like, you really feel Kay's desire to reconcile these two parts of herself. It feels like she was one entirely different person before she had children and an entirely different person after she had children. And she's been living in that after space for so long that she's now missing the before space. Does that sound right? And so it's like it feels like those two sides of herself are at war through this novel, and she's constantly trying to find a way to bring those two together and figure out if there's a way for them to live together inside herself.
it's kind of funny because as I was driving to pick up my daughter, which is why I was late for the Zoom call that we had set up,
Yes.
um, and I was thinking about what we would be talking about
Yeah.
today. And when I wrote the book, I was very much at the sharp edge of that feeling in myself of battling against my former life, which had been very free and very fulfilling, and my life with my children who were then really quite young, and just feeling very trapped and constrained and constantly worrying about whether I was being a good mother,
Mm.
and this constant pressure of like, well, how can I succeed at this? And now, quite a few years later, 4 years maybe since I wrote the book, um, I I don't feel like some of that hasn't shifted. Like I still feel like I might be uh needing to, be more professional sometimes, or not such a good mom sometimes, but I think that I just worry about it less because my
Mm,
kids are 13 now. So it's not that anything's shifted. I think I don't worry about it the way I did when they were sort of 7 or
mm,
6.
yeah.
And there's other things to worry about now, like, are they going to smoke and have boyfriends?
Oh
And
God.
when am I going to find birth controls and
Oh
condoms?
God.
Like, that's the next step. But in terms of managing those two dichotomies of my life, I don't feel like such a split personality anymore. So that's a
Yeah.
good thing.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
there's also, I think there's just a lot of, I don't know, you just have such a generosity toward mothers, I think, in the way that Kay's internal life is expressed in the book. Because I don't know, I think there's a lot of societal pressure to make mothers feel like they have to be a certain way or they have to be a certain kind of mom. I think it's even worse now that we have social media and everybody can look at whatever someone's Instagram or TikTok with their baby is or whatever and go, oh my gosh, should my baby be doing that or should my kid be doing that or are they behind or are they good enough, and it's like Kay clearly loves her children, but she also has a messiness with them at times and makes terrible mistakes. And I think every parent must make terrible mistakes at times. We're all human. So it's like I think it's so generous of you as a novelist, as a writer to offer that to a reader because I don't think that people get to read that often.
I think they don't get to read it that often in a character who's essentially likable.
Mm,
Um, I certainly had, I would do the school run, dropping my kids off at their little like elementary school. I knew that some of the mothers were reading my book, and I kept thinking, oh my God, are they looking at me like I'm this horrible person, who calls my daughter a bitch and
right.
thinks about how they're like eating my time and they're like nibbling at me. And then I sort of thought, well, I think actually everybody has those feelings as a parent. Having those feelings and how you express them are two different things. And
Yes.
that's kind of the same in the beginning of the book when she fantasizes about, smashing her husband's head in with a hammer, which, by the way, my brother-in-law, my husband's brother, like refused to talk to me for months because he was convinced that I harbored murderous
No.
impulses. And I said, look, everybody in marriage reaches the point where it's not that they want to kill their spouse. They just want them to disappear because they can't deal with the emotional intensity of a particular moment or a particular series of moments in that marriage or that time.
Sure.
And I said, that's like, if you don't express that in fiction and you don't give that freedom to your characters to think about those things in fiction, you can't imagine that you sort of make everything impossible for people because, like, what you think and what you do are different
That's
things.
what makes us human, right? Is the the ability to differentiate between having thoughts and having many thoughts, and then the decision to actually act on certain thoughts and not act on other thoughts, right? Like that's the point of humanity, or I guess that's what differentiates us from animals, right?
I think so. I honestly don't think there's a single parent out there who hasn't at at moments thought, I'm just going to get in my car and drive away, and I'm not sure I'm going to come back. Right. And then, something happens that, your child comes in with a little rosary of flowers, or you have to make supper. So you just get on with it, but we all have those moments of complete and utter panic of like, oh my God, what have I done? I can't do this. I have to run away. And we don't. I mean, some
Yeah.
people do. And of course, you know, in the book, there are some people who really do these awful things.
Yeah.
And they're caught in a completely different, sort of psychological slide. Because I,
Yeah.
I do think that, this book does explore that edge of that slippery slope of where you go if you do follow those impulses.
Mm,
Have the impulse, but what happens if you tip into that impulse?
right.
Then what do you become, and how do you come back from that?
Yeah, there's a lot of really challenging things that are in this book. It's making me think about the General Christmas, but I want to put a pin in that for a second because I want to go back to your brother-in-law Because it's interesting. One of my questions for today was, do you find that people you know read your work and then assume that it's real in some way? And that's kind of proof that that's happening somewhere. Like, do you feel like you have to fight the impulse to kind of filter yourself when you're writing because you're thinking about someone like your brother-in-law taking it personally or thinking it's real toward your husband?
Um, I think I'm a bit contrary in that sense, in that I've actually sort of goad it now, because Kay's husband, Michael,
Yeah.
is a documentary maker, right? My husband, Matt, is a wildlife filmmaker. So
Mm,
I almost purposely laid out that sort of trail of crumbs,
yeah.
because I think one of the great things, if you're a writer and you have to entertain yourself, right? Because writing a book is essentially a deeply tedious process. So
Yeah.
you have to keep it interesting for yourself. And so I love the idea of sort of playing with this line of like what people will think is real and what people will
Ooh.
think I made up. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know if it's a manipulation, but it's a bit puppet mastery, but it keeps it interesting for me. And I am constantly surprised when people go, "Oh, I know exactly where that house is." And I'm like, "Well, do you?"
You're like,
Because
that's news to me because I don't know where it is.
tell me. Um, but there was one thing that was real. So the writing that she finds in this
Oh
closet,
yeah, the
and
scribbling in the closet. Yeah.
right. So this is one of those sort of defining incidents. I was uh staying in a house years ago, and they were a lovely family. They were both, professional people. They had lovely kids. They came from quote unquote good families. By all appearances, they seemed to be really, normal,
Yeah.
and upstanding citizens. Is a nice house. And I was looking for blankets one night, so I found this closet, and I opened up the closet, and there was a hole in the wall, and it was the size of a fist,
Fist.
right? So clearly somebody had punched the wall inside the closet, and there was this weird ass writing. I can't remember what it was now, but it was something like, you have to ride that bull of hate and blah blah blah.
Oh
And
wow.
I remember thinking, wow, this is really interesting that you have the facade. And I don't even know if I would go to say so much as a facade. I think we all have our public marriage, and we all have a private marriage, and we all have a marriage that's different for each spouse. But I really, every time I looked at them after that, I thought, oh man, I know something about you. I
Wow.
like,
You might
and
know
I,
something that one of the other ones didn't know about each other.
I don't know. I mean, I would think they would both be aware of the fact that there was this
There's a
hole
hole
punched in
punched
the
in the
closet
closet.
where the blankets were kept. But yeah, so I sort of followed that and thought, what if this was, really, really was creepy? And then I sort of spun it into that whole thing about the owners of the house that disappeared, and what happened to them. And so yeah, that was, the rest was my imagination. But that was, I thought, like a really provoking moment.
That is incredibly provocative. And I was interested even how you chose the exact words that were written on the wall in the so for anyone listening who hasn't read the book yet, there is a very tiny cabinet, right? I'm imagining this correctly, right? It's like at the baseboard sort of the bathroom, and Kay stumbles upon it accidentally because of the weird position she has to be in the bathroom to get a bar of cell service to be able to make a call, which is also a great image. And she opens it and realizes that there's a latch from the inside. So she realizes someone was purposefully going in and then getting out from the inside. And that there's writing on the wall, and it relates to pigs. And so obviously there's a huge payoff of this in the story, but I was curious, just for you, knowing where it was going with the sort of animal abuse history that was there between Ben and Frank and Amon. How did you choose that particular phrase to be the phrase that was scratched on the cabinet?
I honestly, Jen, I have I have
No
no
idea.
idea. I have no
It's too
idea.
long ago now.
I don't even think of it. I don't even think it was, there are some things that are hard to write and some things that you you work on, but I don't remember that as being, I remember it just feeling very visceral,
Yeah.
um, something that would frighten me. Um, that was in a sense a child's language, but you sense
Mm,
that it wasn't a child.
yeah.
So I remember being aware that it had to feel like an adult wrote this, even though there was a sort of childish
Childlikeness.
element to it. Like you wouldn't feel sure
Yeah.
who you were dealing with. Like when I saw that the fist punch in the wall and the writing, you have to write, you have to write you anger like a bull or whatever it was.
Yeah.
That was clearly an adult who wrote that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to play a little bit more with, you know, who wrote this and why were they hiding in the closet? And, clearly they were out of their mind in some way.
At least in that moment, right? I feel like you give Kay a lot of generosity where she can be crazy in certain moments and totally sane in others, just like all of us. Um, that's so fascinating. It's so interesting too how these moments that become visceral as you're writing aren't necessarily something that have to be so carefully constructed that years later you're like, oh God, I remember how arduous that was. It was something that just felt really visceral in the moment. Um, this doesn't have anything to do with that, but I've been thinking about this a lot. I love all of the just the texture of the book. Sorry, the book is very marked up. It's very loved. Hopefully that makes you feel good. No, but it's like I just don't know how this works. So I'm a little bit in the dark. I know I've asked a couple authors about this before of like how the cover gets chosen, but I realized there's like a real specificity in this one, even with like every chapter starts on a new page, which I love personally. The capitalization, the big capitalization of a first letter, the little pattern, like are these things that you get to decide and choose, or are these things that you just kind of you open your printed book one day and go, oh, that's cool?
One of the beauties of working with $2 Radio is that Eric Openoff does all the covers, and I think he is sort of, got a real genius for it.
Yeah.
And his wife, Eliza Wood Openoff, she was the one, because we had an issue with the fact that the story flips between Kay's perspective and Ben, the logger.
Yeah.
And so it flipped back and forth. And she was the one who actually suggested that we use the little um, different symbol at the top of each chapter that would help you figure out whether you were with Ben or with Kay.
Yeah, the book kind of has a lot of decoding because the italics is the past and sort of the memories that
Yes.
Kay is having, and that's feels to me like her past life as a journalist pre-children, and then the non-italic print is the present, but the present also between Kay and Ben. And I realized that the symbol traded off, but I didn't connect that the different symbols were based on whose perspective it was. Both as an actor and as a director, sleep is super important and really hard to get because our schedules are never the same. Sometimes we start at 4 in the morning, sometimes we start at noon, sometimes we start at midnight and we work all night. So it's really important to find a way to fall asleep whenever I need to fall asleep. And I finally found a solution. I found Beam Dream Powder. It's incredible. Not only do they have incredible flavors and it works and it helps me sleep, but I wake up feeling super rested and refreshed and ready to go. There is a reason that the top business people and top athletes in the world are also using Beam Dream Powder. And I reached out to them and they have been super kind and have offered a discount for any of our listeners. So if you go to shopbeam.com/Jen's Bookshelf, you can get a discount. Get 35% off a subscription or 15% off a one-time purchase. Just use the code Jen's Bookshelf. Sleep has never tasted better.
It was quite a challenge. I don't know why I do this with my books. It was quite a challenge to align their stories, particularly aligning her past and when to sort of weave in this past story of hers and make it not just inform who she was as a person, who she had become, but inform the present choices that she was making.
Yes.
So there was a lot of sort of structural fiddling that went on to get that pacing right. I do think I had one criticism from a friend whose opinion I really care about, and he basically said I could have pulled back on the throttle a little bit at the end, and I kind of think he's right. But
What do you mean by pulled back on the throttle? You in terms of how much of the past was in there?
no, I think that he felt I got too brutal at the end, and that I could have maybe just, gone one murder less at the
I
end.
don't know. I think it's interesting because I'm going to disagree with your friend
Oh,
because I feel like you need to believe that Ben is for sure going to kill Kay in that last scene. And I feel like when Ben decides to quote unquote allow Siobhan to overdose, that feels like in terms of murder terms a little bit easy. Like I know he has to kind of help her follow through with it, but it still feels not as murderous as when he actually strangles I can't think of his name, but the father of it's some weird name.
is it the Wheeze? Is it Wheeze? I can't
Oh,
remember
maybe it
myself.
is.
Is
I
he
don't.
called the Wheeze?
He's the guy who brings her Dunkin' Donuts. The
Yeah,
Dunkin' Donut
yeah, I can't remember
coffee.
his name. I
It's something that his name was like Duncan, but they call him Dilts or something, or it's a weird name. Let me see if I can find
I
it
should
quickly.
I should know. It's pretty. I
But
that
you
the
wrote the
thing.
book 5 years ago. I mean, I'm making you dig out an old story while you're in the middle of writing another book. So this is my fault, Melanie. I take total credit for this problem. I don't see it quickly, but anyway, it doesn't matter what his name is. He's the guy who's technically the father of Jake. Um,
Dinko, Dinko,
Dinko, there we go. Yeah.
Dinko. That's it. That's it. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you say that, Jim, because that was my thinking behind it. Was, you have to have someone like Ben who you've come to like as a character. I mean, I
Mhm.
have this real obsession. I don't know if I talked about this before, but with good people who do bad things.
You haven't
And
talked about
probably
it before, but I feel that in this book in
right.
big time. Yeah,
And bad people who do good things. Because I think that
exactly.
I, I I'm not sure what that let flip is. And obviously she talks about that with General Christmas somewhat, but I felt like you really had to have sympathy for Ben and be on his side, and then be understanding of him when he did this terrible thing. Like, as you
Yeah.
said, you're somewhat sympathetic with Siobhan, but then with Dinko, you're like, really? Was that really necessary? Even though you kind of suspect that, yeah, it is necessary, like the actual act of doing it, and that tipping point that he is in himself. Where does he go from here? He's going to become all the horrible people who abused him as a child.
Yeah.
So I think that, like, I think you're right, actually, that you do you do have to.
You really have to
I
think he's going to kill her, or you don't have an end to the book.
Yeah.
It's like, and I just don't know that if he had set up Siobhan to have that moment and then kind of had to help her follow through with it, I don't know if I'd be like, oh, this guy's a murderer and he's for sure killing Kay. And what happens is that there's this really and it's amazing, like the cataclysmic event that causes the change in both of these people simultaneously. To me, that's the magic of the structure of the book, and it sounds like it took some finagling to get there, but you have these two stories side by side with Ben and Kay of everything they're going through and the different things that they've experienced in their lives and the different ways that they're grappling with the idea of parenthood, for them to end up in this moment together where they both could be either the worst versions of themselves or the best versions of themselves. And it's only because the two of them are together in that moment that they change. And like that to me is fascinating because there was no one else that could have caused that change in each other except for each other in that moment. And that to me is like magic at the end of a book.
actually loved writing that scene. I mean, I worked on it quite a lot because I had to, again, get the timing right,
Yeah.
get each character inching towards that moment. But I love the idea of Ben, hearing these birds, probably with cedar waxwings, skittering, peeping across the lake. And then the idea that like the blood in his heart
Yeah.
actually reverses and goes the other way. I found, sometimes when you're writing, you're like, oh God, I love doing this. This is so, you're completely swept away by these characters who you've created. It feels completely magic, and it probably does make up for all the rest of the time you're literally just like banging your head against the keyboard going, why am I doing this? This is so horrible.
Yeah, you live for those moments to get you through. But yeah, I mean, it was just, there's something really spectacular about after he's now murdered two people and on the path to becoming more like Aman than anyone else, which is the last person he ever wanted to be like. In a way,
Yes.
I know, tell me if I'm wrong, but like I saw the murder of the Dunkin' Donuts guy um as like a weird bookend to when Aman forced Frank to kill the dog in that early part of the book.
So the the dog killing was, my mom like immediately called me up. She's like, you can't have this in the book. You'll give people ideas. And I said, well, I really hope I don't. And again, like as I wrote that scene, I thought, should I be doing this? Should I?
Mm,
Should I? And then I don't know. Are you gonna pull back from your instinct? And my instincts are pretty dark. I mean, I would say that this book I'm writing now is much less dark, and probably because I did feel a little bit okay. Yeah, I want to go a little less, Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian, and maybe a little bit towards something else. So, but this was a dark book for me, and I
mm,
felt I was writing it in winter,
mm.
alone, looking after my kids in Vermont, and it's a long winter to
Yeah.
be alone with your
Well, and
kids.
also they can't go outside, they can't run around. I mean,
Oh,
that's a lot.
oh no, they go outside.
Oh, they
They
did.
go
Okay, okay.
outside. Oh
You're like, get the snowsuit on, go out.
yeah. See you later. Um, that's what skiing is for. So um, we're lucky enough to live near a little ski hill.
Oh, great.
So yeah. So no, that's definitely what skiing is for. You just leave them at the mountain with $10 and I'll pick you up at 3. Good luck. So hope for the best. It's called independence. It's called building independence, Jenny.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
very
I
important.
understand. I understand. As many of you know, I am obsessed with Frida Salvador shoes, and I am so excited to say that this episode is brought to you by Frida Salvador. Style is a part of all of us. It's the first way we express ourselves in the morning, and it's the first impression we give to those around us. But finding that right piece that's both comfortable and expresses your individual style takes time. And that's why I wanted to introduce you to my favorite brand, Frida Salvador, designed in California by my friends Christina and Megan. They are inspired by individual style, and they are on a mission to build community from the ground up. I cannot tell you how many times when I'm wearing these shoes, someone comes up to me and goes, look, I'm wearing them too. Aren't they so amazing? Isn't it incredible how comfortable they are? This shoe really has a community around it. They are the coolest shoes and accessories handcrafted by artisans in Spain and El Salvador with the highest quality Italian leathers they can find. I love these styles because they are classic but reimagined with statement details. And I also trust Frida to deliver impeccably made pieces that will be in my closet forever. I love them. I wear them almost every day. I highly recommend you check out their latest collection, and I will give you 15% off with my code Jen's Bookshelf. Just visit fridasalvador.com for 15% off with the code Jen's Bookshelf. Well, so I also was interested because I know you were a journalist. Were you a journalist that was in as much danger as Kay was once in?
No, I wasn't. I mean, I definitely I had some of those experiences. So at the very, I think it was in the early 90s, I went up to Uganda, which was then just recently liberated from, Milton Obote and Idi Amin and all these
Mm-hmm.
terrible, terrible things that had happened. At that point, Museveni, um, uh, who had won, was seen as a hero. He's now like a completely crazy man. But at that point he was a liberator. So I had gone up with another journalist, and we were in the very far north, where this character called Joseph Kony, who I think is still alive. I can't remember the last of it, but he is obviously one of the inspirations, if that's the right word, for General Christmas.
Sure.
But we did go to this. It was very deserted up there. There were all these villages that had been abandoned because people were fleeing from Joseph Kony. And we did go to this one village where that opening scene in the book, where there's this dress, dismantled dress on the ground, like that was a real thing. And there's very frightening graffiti all over the walls, a lot of it deeply misogynistic and very violent. So and we did sort of come to some very sketchy checkpoints, and like 2 days later, after we got back to Nairobi, some Italian journalists went missing. So and I think so I was never a war correspondent like Kay, but I was around people who were. I listened to their stories, and certainly just being in that very, very quiet, creepily quiet place, that did stay with me.
And how did you come to, so this, what happens between General Christmas and Kay, where he calls her to him and allows her to ask these questions, or gives her space to ask these questions. She's super pregnant at the time. She says to him, when was the first time you felt evil? He immediately lobs that back at her, saying, you don't know what my life is. You don't know what decisions you would make unless, if you were in my shoes with the circumstances that I'm in. And there's like a cat and mouse back and forth between them about what is evil, what isn't evil, who is evil all immersive, is it not? And then he says, if you ever need me, especially with any medical stuff with the pregnancy and the country that they're in, I'll take care of you. And she ends up in desperate need of medical care and does actually call him on that favor. And he takes that opportunity to then put her in a position where she has to make a selfish decision that she'll have to live with for the rest of her life, where he falsely promises that he's going to help these other women with her, and then says, I'll either help them or I'll help your child. And she ultimately chooses her child and has to then feel, quote unquote, the evil that he was saying, you don't know what you would do if you were in my position. Now, that was so intense, and it's such a Sophie's choice situation. And that I started thinking of it as if it really happened. And then I realized your brain had to come up with it. And I was like, wait, Melanie had to come up with this. How did you do that? Like, what was the puzzle pieces where you realized, oh, this is how this man can help her understand that we all have the capacity for moments like this in ourselves?
Well, I think part of it was growing up in Kenya, and for a long time feeling myself to be very special, and to somehow be separate or better than the sort of the violence that's unfolding all around one in the way we portray, quote unquote, Africa. I became really aware, and obviously this is something I would ideally one day explore in another book, but I'm not quite sure how to do that. I became really aware that I was making choices because I was white, and my whiteness gave me a safety. Like, with Kay, when she makes this decision to go up to see General Christmas in the middle of nowhere, and she's heavily pregnant, she thinks that being white and pregnant makes her safe. And in many ways it does. Like, you have this magic shield, because to kill a white person is somehow more dangerous than killing hundreds of even today, if we read newspaper accounts, it's like, a tourist was killed by some random gun shooting in Nairobi, and there's a newspaper article about it. Meanwhile, somewhere else in Africa, 300 people have been killed by some marauding militia. And I just wanted to unpack that a little bit, about what it's like to have that white privilege and how it actually plays out. And
Yeah.
what happens if somebody kind of throws it back in your face and says, well, you know, you're so special. You're so special, you know, prove that you're so special,
Mm.
because being special means that you get a ride in a helicopter. You know, that powerful scene at the end. I don't know if you've ever seen The Killing Fields, but that very
Mhm.
powerful scene at the end. Oh God, you have to see it.
Right.
It's
Yeah, I don't want
such,
to forget.
I mean, I'm dating myself with it, but there's this scene at the end where the fall of Saigon and it's helicopters lifting off the top of the American embassy and all these people trying to come on board. I mean, much the same as we saw pulling out of Afghanistan, people just desperately
Oh
trying to
yeah,
leave.
hanging out of the plane. Yep.
And who's on the plane? You know, lots of white people. So yeah, I think it was just for her to have a reckoning for that moment. And I think she is trying to figure out how to put that
Yeah.
piece in.
I
And I don't
wondered
think
if
you ever
that
do.
was, yeah, I wondered if that was part of what haunts her all the way through where she's at. You know what I mean? Like the fact that she's having this moment where, you know, she and Michael have this kind of murky exchange before he goes off to do what he does. But I remember thinking early in the book, like, well, but I don't think he left her. They didn't agree to never be together again. But in her mind, there was like her marriage was over. Like she'd started to dissolve it in some way. And then the way that she self-destructs so many things in this short period of time, I wondered if there was sort of, I don't know if that was like residue from the way that that moment made her feel about herself.
I think Jonathan Franzen uses a line, I think it's in one of his books, Freedom, maybe. And he talks about, you know, having the courage of your privilege.
Mm,
Um, I think one of the things for Kay is living with this privilege that she has and, you know, knowing what the other side of that looks like. And so when you're not good enough, when you're not a good enough parent, when you know, you seem to be failing, you feel like you're failing that debt, you know, that debt that
mm,
you owe to be the best person, to kind of, you know, lead by example, to make up for that crime of leaving these women behind. Um, and then when, you know, she feels that she's not doing it, she feels like she's failing. I think that is for a moral person, that is a very, very deep, yeah, very deep source of
yeah.
her depression and sadness.
And then at the same time, she holds this really painful grudge, I guess, against her husband for what he did with this water bottle, where there was like the water, you know, so these kids were constantly throwing coins at the or pebbles at the car to try to get him to stop to help them. And he eventually just goes and stabs the water bottle to make them stop. And he says they have to learn or they'll keep doing it. And she never saw her husband the same way again after that, because it felt like such a deeply moral immoral thing to have done in terms of their ability to get water and the food that they would need. And so she holds that against him so deeply and never sees him the same way again. Am I seeing that right? That moment is really critical of how she sees her husband.
Yes. And I mean, that is based on an incident that a friend told me about her
Oh wow.
husband. Um, so I think we all come into marriage with an idea of who we're marrying and who we want to be married to. And either abruptly or gradually, we see the other side of this person, because everybody, you know, has layers of complexity. And
Sure.
I think if you can allow that complexity of character to your spouse, that can actually have some quite horrible things in there, then you are more forgiving of it when you feel it in yourself.
Mm,
So, but again, you know, we're operating in so many moral gray areas with these characters. You know, Michael is not a bad person. He's a
no.
loving father,
Yeah.
and you know, clearly makes prize-winning documentaries in dangerous situations. But you know, he did this really, really shitty thing. So um, I think that my characters all dwell in this ambiguity, and I think maybe that's what freaks people out when I show up at the bake sale, with like brownies, for the to raise money for the Latin debate club or whatever it is. It's like, oh my God, what she put in those brownies? But yeah, I just think we all have these dark sides, and some of us have less control of them than others, and occasionally they leak out, but sometimes the light leaks out too, and we're
Yeah.
capable of doing great, amazing things to save ourselves or to save other people. So yeah.
Yeah, it was just interesting to me because I thought, in a way, maybe she judged him harsher because she was judging herself so harshly for the moment with with the helicopter with General Christmas and the decision to save her child. You know what I mean? Like, which anyone would do. Of course, everyone's going to save their own child. There's, you don't, that's what you choose. But she
I
was
think
just,
it's the I think it's the stories that you tell yourself too, because she had told
mm,
herself a story about that event, and then she had to be honest with herself over a series of writing it over and over again.
mm,
No, that's not what happened. And
yeah,
I think we all fall into a trap of writing narratives about, what happened and how it went down. And when you really examine it, you're like, well, maybe I was a lot more culpable than I thought. And,
yeah.
you know, I think that kind of self-honesty, you either find it or, just walk away from life, I think.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because right, that's kind of the difference a little bit between Ben and Frank, where Frank, his decision is that he needs to end things and that there's no hope for him to be able to find a place where the light could leak out, and then ultimately it feels a little bit like the memory of Frank is in those birds that help Ben make a decision to find that light and to have the blood pump the other way in his heart in that end moment.
I think sometimes it does take incredible courage to do the right thing and to be the better person, especially if you have the kind of childhood that Ben had, and yet you also deeply understand why Frank just couldn't do
Oh,
it anymore. I mean, some people
yeah.
just can't. They
Yeah.
just can't. But Ben, but Ben has to move forward, and be the father that this little boy needs.
Yeah.
So it's I'm grateful that that Ben came forward for that. Like, I always knew that he would, but I had to make it feel very precarious for him that he wouldn't, that it would be real
Yeah,
for him not to do it.
I agree. And it also felt like he needed to have had the moments that he had with Kay leading up to that to also have a tenderness in him in that moment, or an opportunity for tenderness in that moment.
I wanted to. I kind of love that love affair that they have.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have to say, I often think like, oh God, if this was a series, right? She would have to come back to Vermont, and there would always be this question of what would happen if she saw Ben again. Like, how would that
Oh,
play out
yeah.
in the second
How do you
season?
think it
Where
would play out? I'm so curious.
I think it's one of those things, there are just people in your life who you're just deeply attracted to and always will be, no matter what. And so you're always in their presence, you're always playing with this idea of wanting to be with them and
Hmm.
fighting against that. I mean, it's probably just a chemical thing. But I think I don't know if you, Jen, I don't know about you, but I definitely know that there were people in my life who just in their presence, I felt completely like, I just don't want to be apart from this person, even if
Oh,
I'm not
wow.
their lover. I just
Yeah.
need to be with them. I need to be in their sphere. I need to know that they're down the street, or in the same town, or I can see their light across the valley or something like that. So yeah, I think that the love affair with Kay and Ben is definitely not over.
All right, I'm ready for season two. I feel
Okay.
like you did talk about at some point that this was like maybe gonna be a show or a movie. Was it optioned at some point, or what happened?
So it was sort of options. We sort of talked about it with a producer in London, and we sort of went down some track, but it never. He ended up going to work on this project in Japan, and I don't know, life just carries you along. But I have to admit, I always was like, this is a really great, as you say, Winter's Bone thriller about, set in a rural area, like these creepy people, this love affair, these things. And then, there's a season 2. She comes back, she's got to confront Eamon. There's a whole other thing going on.
Yeah.
But, what can you do? I think all of these stories, if they're powerful stories, they feel like there's a season 2 and a season 3 and a season 4. That's how it
Kind
should
of, you
feel.
know what? Have you seen Top of the Lake?
Yes.
It's got a little bit of that in it, doesn't it? Like it has a little bit of that like rural crime that is so convoluted.
But season 2, Top of the Lake, wasn't very
It wasn't as sizzly. Yeah.
It wasn't as sizzly. Well, then I don't know, like I dropped out halfway through because I couldn't get it anymore on whatever I was watching. So I don't know what happened.
I did watch it. I mean, the thing is, like, I mean, Jane Campion is she just brings out such incredible performances. Everything feels like a documentary somehow, but like the most compelling thing you've ever watched. But there's, and it's so quirky, right? It's like the women living in those trailers that were on that land, and I don't know, just like these really, really specific quirky characters. I feel like that they live in this book as well, and in their own versions of it. And even all the stuff with the logging, and the fact that Ben felt like he was going to have to kill Kay to stop her from getting in the way of what he needed to do to be able to make the money he needed to be able to make, by doing something super illegal in order to do this very good thing, which was to take care of Jake and try to give him a good life. It was like, he's doing this terrible thing that he has to keep a secret in order to do this very good thing. And she was accidentally threatening the revelation of the terrible thing, which could stop him from doing the good thing. And he was willing to kill someone over that. And it's weirdly like just it's so specific that it feels like it must have actually happened, even though it didn't.
Well, I think I mean, living in a place like this, obviously we had, some of this came through in the hair, but you're aware that people don't have choices. They have ultimatums. And one of the other things that inspired me was, I don't know whether I talked about this trailer that had like was abandoned. There was a photograph in the paper of this mobile home that somebody had been trying to tow from point A to point B, and it fell off the back of whatever was towing it, and whoever it was just left it there and drove away. And it was in the local paper, and I had this picture of this abandoned trailer in the middle of the road, and I thought about, someone was actually trying to take that somewhere to live in it, and it fell off its wheels, and they didn't have the resources
to go get it,
to collect it. And I think we forget there are people who really have so few resources, and that the struggle to get out of whatever shitty situation they found themselves in, it's such a battle. And you are clawing your way out. I mean, dairy farms around here have been going out of business left, right, and center. People just can't make a living at it anymore. I think in our town, in our community alone, 7 dairy farms in the last couple of years. So,
oh God,
what do people do when that happens? And everybody can't go on government aid or go and retrain or open up a boutique hemp farm. It's so I think one thing to really think about, what you do when you have to do it, and what that feeling of being cornered, what desperation pushes people to do.
It really makes both your novels that I've read so far have made me think about how every crime comes from a need, like, and it's so easy, again, when you're privileged and you're safe and you're in a gated community, or you have an alarm system, or you have enough money for food, it's like it's easy to forget that, and the truth is, like, no one wakes up and is like, oh, I want to be a criminal. They need something, and if they're desperate enough for that need, there could be a crime committed in order to fill that need. Like, there's really no other motivation for crime.
Well, one of the things about living in a small rural community, murders happen here, terrible things happen,
Mm.
but it's a small community. So you can't other it. You can't say, like, maybe
Mm.
if you're in LA, these are people and their neighborhoods that and maybe you even know somebody who this happened to. You certainly intimately know the road that it happened. I mean, the guy who plowed our driveway for years, he was a sweet guy. He ended up, falling off the wagon,
Oh.
getting into drugs. He went away to prison. He came back. He ended up being shot to death in the hospital parking lot.
Oh God.
So, right. So this stuff is really intimate when you're in a
You're in a
small
small
town.
town. Yeah. There's
So
nowhere else to turn.
there is no, and things happen to people, and people, do things. So the paper is full of names that you recognize. And I think it forces you to consider, the questions that come up in the underneath of, like, who is capable of what, and what
Yeah.
pushes people to do things, because they're not, it's so easy to say people are just evil, but
No.
that's not
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And, that's interesting because it gets me to another question, which is that, when we spoke last season about the hair, you'd said that you often start with a question that drives your writing. Do you remember what that question was for the underneath for you?
There had been a really terrible murder here. A young teacher at the local academy was brutally murdered by
Mm.
this couple, who
What?
obviously just created this insane narrative about her. It's a horrible story. I don't really want
Wow. No, you don't have to tell it. It's all right.
to talk
Don't,
about it, but I
don't put yourself
remember.
through it. It's okay.
But it was a little bit, what I was saying before. How did this happen? Like,
Yeah.
how did they go to this place in their head where this made sense to them?
Yeah.
And, like, because, they weren't horrific people. I mean, they may have been, a bit short on the IQ straw, but they weren't, they weren't abusing animals. They weren't,
Yeah.
they weren't like red flags. They just went down this track with this story, and it became real to them. And I was just curious. I don't know why anyone would want to, but
Wow.
um, I just wanted to, explore, that kind of dark, slippery slope that I think is in everybody. Um, and I mean, I'm a Scorpio, so I guess I'm always going to be thinking about that stuff.
Um, yeah, wow. That's so wild. And it was like a couple that had never really there was no crime, there was something like that that happened by where I grew up, that I remember really vividly. I think it was called Brown's Chicken, and it's like a little fast food chicken place, and the workers that worked there, when like someone went in and just literally executed everyone who was working there late night. And I don't even remember. I feel like they did end up catching, like, I don't know, some young people who did it, like maybe early 20s or something. And it was like this thing of like this guy that wanted to see if he could get away with it. But again, it was like, what? Like,
Yeah.
it's so bizarre when things like that just seem to randomly sprout up in an area that's unexpected. And
I think that's what's so terrifying is we always want certainty. Like, we want to think,
yeah,
but there is no certainty. And I guess that's, certainly something that, as a journalist like Kay, you are well grounded in the fact that anything can happen and people are
yeah,
capable of anything. And going back to that theme again, which comes up in the gloaming, and it certainly comes up in the hair. So I guess at the end of the day, I always wonder if it's possible to have compassion for people who do terrible things.
Mm,
Um, I don't know if it is. Maybe if you don't know the victims,
yeah,
then you can. But I think the more we can live with ambiguities of being human, the more we accept that there's so many transgressions in our minds and our hearts and in everybody's, and that we kind of embrace complexity.
yeah,
I think i think the oversimplification of things is, and wanting everything to be simple and easy is, and in straight lines is a problem,
yeah.
because we're just messy. We're primates. We're messy.
Yeah, and everywhere everyone is trying to divide everything into this side and that side right now, and it's just so impossible to do that, and yet that's what everybody is clinging to. They're wanting to create these boundaries. It's like, oh, there's a border to this country, and this is who we are, and that's who you are, and it's like, I don't know.
We
It's
want we want lawns, but basically what we've got is wildly overgrown brush.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Oh man. One of the things that kind of comes up for Kay early on is how journalism has kind of been usurped by the blogger world. Is that something that you feel like is true? And within that, are there publications that you still read that you feel like have stayed the course in some way, or has it all kind of dissolved?
There was a huge shift between, when I was working as a journalist in the 80s and 90s, early 90s. You could make a living as a freelancer, and
Yeah.
um, journalists still got paid real money, and um, were sort of, I don't want to, I mean, journalists have always been gotten themselves in trouble, but I think that there was a certain respect for what you did, and that definitely has shifted now. I know, so many journalists who now they just unless you work for one of the big news organizations, you're you're literally like fighting against people on Twitter who are reducing something complicated to two or three lines. So,
Yeah.
um, in terms of, oh gosh, what do I read? Um, I read Northern Woodlands magazine. How about that? That
No
is a
way.
fine example. That is fine example of local journalism, and a very, high end, well conceived publication about how conservation, land use, and working the land can all kind of combine. So there's that. And I read the New York Times,
Hmm.
and I watch Fox News, and
You get a
I,
nice, well-rounded.
I think it's important, because otherwise you
Yeah.
just hear your own,
Yeah.
whatever it is,
Echo.
chatter. So,
Yeah.
and I think there are still amazingly great journalists out there. Thank goodness. I mean, we still have
Yeah.
papers like the Times,
Yeah.
which does that, incredible work. And still, like, even my local paper,
Yeah.
the Caledonia Record. What a great local paper. They have no money, but they're out there covering local events. They have a really thriving letters page where everybody piles in and, writes about this or that. It's the real heart of the community, and
Yeah.
what America would be like without its local papers. I think it's a real, it's something to really be scared of when we lose our local papers.
Yeah. I mean, that's something interesting to think about because I've only lived in big cities for so long now that it never, I don't know what a paper like that even looks like. I've never lived in a small town to get that paper. So
I'll
that's so
send you,
interesting. Yeah,
I'll
I would
send
love to
you,
see
I'll
it.
send you a couple of copies of the Caledonia Record, because
That's
it's
awesome.
got like the police blotter, and some picture of a guy speeding up the road, just down the road, escaping police on a motorbike. Have you seen this man?
Oh my gosh.
Like,
That's
it's,
amazing.
Caledonia Fair, whose cow won, like, and so but it holds the community together, and actually the standard of journalism is amazingly high in
Yeah.
these little papers.
That's so hopeful. That's so encouraging because it's like, you start looking around going like, what is truth even anymore? Like it's everything just feels so, I don't know, like everything just doesn't exist. You're like, well, everyone spins the story to be what they want the story to be, or from the lens that they want the story to be from, or, and it's so hard to, the amount of
I,
times I've seen something, a headline or whatever, based on an event I was either at or something I witnessed. And it's like, no, that's not how I saw that at all. It's like, but someone has an agenda that they're pushing to have certain buzzwords.
I would argue that America's small town papers are probably the last sort of arenas of truth, because they're so directly responsible to their readers,
Mm.
right? And in a small town like this, you have Republicans, you have Trump Republicans, you have progressive Democrats, you have liberals, you have this
You have the
whole
whole
range of
mix.
people. And so the requirement that you report something for all those people in a way that feels true to them
Yeah.
is really important, but you're
Which used
representing
to be what
everybody the same.
everyone used to have to do,
Right,
instead of choosing a
right,
side and aligning
right.
themselves with whoever owns the big company or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I know we need to wrap up, but that leads me to my last, I guess, thought sort of question, which is just, I thought it was so beautiful that, really the very, very end of the book, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read it, turn this off now if you don't want to know the very, very end, but it's just the sentence, "Let us love." And I thought that was just so beautiful, because when you've got Ben and Kay in this, I almost turned them into Ken. Kay and Ben became Ken in my mind. But you have them together in this moment where Kay doesn't know what she's going to have racing through her mind, or what she'll be desiring as she's facing certain death, until she faces certain death, which is that she so craves to see her children, she would give anything to have another moment near them. And then for Ben, he could just go into this habit of like what Eamon would do, and just eliminate any potential threat, and yet then has this ability to be brave enough to let her love and to let himself love. And it does sort of feel like, even after all of the heavy, dark, intense things that these people have navigated, that the scariest thing that they're ever going to navigate is love. Is that intended, or am I projecting that?
No, I think you've got that, Jennifer. I also think it's a mantra.
Mm,
We all get overwhelmed with everything that's required of us. And at the end of the day, the best thing is to be able to love. Like,
yeah.
no matter what horrible things you've done or horrible things have been done to you. I can't remember this. I think it might even be from Moulin Rouge by Baz Luhrmann. And it's that line, all she wants is to love and be loved in return.
Mm,
Right? Like, it's at the end of the day, if we could just say that, let us love, it's I kind of, yeah. I mean, let us love.
I found it so emotional when Kay starts saying that over and over, and because it's so not out of character, but it's not what you come to expect of her, because she has been so intense and so tough in certain ways, and so messy in the way that she's expressed herself to her children. It's like you get used to her edges, right? And so then when you suddenly have this person with those edges going, just let me love, let me love. I was like tearing
Oh,
up reading it, because I just thought,
oh,
someone becomes that tough because they're protecting that tenderness, and that's the only way their tenderness can survive the world. I mean, it's Siobhan, right? I mean, it's like you've got this addict who is doing all sorts of crazy things and lying and doing anything she can to get more drugs, but everything she owns is pink and soft, and you just realize she's like this little delicate flower that just can't shoulder the rough world around her, and that the drugs were taking the edge off. So I don't know, there was just something really, really emotional about Kay in particular being that vulnerable in that moment, and it was really, really emotional for me as I got to the end of the novel.
Oh, well, good. I mean, yeah, I think, for someone who's damaged to just decide to love can be
Oof.
frightening. But like,
Yeah.
it's a decision. It's a decision to love,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So,
Well,
yeah.
I love it. Let us love.
Let us love. Thank you, Jen.
We're gonna keep loving, Melanie, until we get your next book, and then we're gonna talk about that one.
Great. Well, I'm going to keep writing then, just for
Okay,
you,
good.
Jen. I'm going to keep going.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for taking the time as always, and we'll talk to you next season.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Thanks so much.